Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. It's nice to be back again at this time reading our book, Children of the Archbishop by Norman Collins. And last night in the show, I was having issues with which fader I was fiddling with. I just want to make sure I've got the right fader in my fingers. It's because it was obscured by the microphone, my little mixing desk down there. Cooper says he's melting today. Is it hot where you are, Cooper? So, hello to the lovely Julia. Hello to TurboStream, to Sean's Garden Diary, to Audrey Forbes, to Justine Jones, to Steve G, to Andrew Norris. What ho to you? To Billabong O'Neill, to Nigel Sadler, to Cooper, 68, Dave over yonder, Philip Hammond and Mary. Good afternoon to you, Mary and Phil. John F, Lee Lawson, and anybody else who's come in. Yes, thank you, Lee. Nice brown. You may not know what she's talking about there, but I think Mary might know what's going on, and other people are slowly noticing. Above zero. Is it above zero? Where I forget where you are, Cooper. Nigel Sadler. So, we're in brown today. Yes. The chocolate soldier, says Dave over yonder. Actually, do you know, I've just had some chocolate. It was lovely. Afternoon, says Ben Reeve. First sighting of snow this winter for me in Buckinghamshire. Didn't last, though. We had some sleet the other day, but it wasn't snow. It wasn't. I can't count it as snow, no matter how much. Oh, Nova Scotia. Oh, right. Gosh. Ooh, new jumper day, says Turbo. Yes, I had received delivery today. Check's in the post, Mary. Check is in the post. Let me know that you get it. Okay. Yes, I have this one and another one. It's a second blue, actually, but it's a blue with this collar, whereas the other one had a wider collar. And I have to say, this wool is beautiful wool that Mary's been using on all of these jumpers. Absolutely love it. And I couldn't resist saving up and commissioning Mary to do. I hope you make something out of this, because I imagine that most of the money must go on the wool, because there's a lot of jumper there, Mary. There's a lot of jumper, so I hope you get something out of it. Nigel Sadler says, I'm wearing the Vobes hoodie today. Ha-ha! Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much. That's really cool. And Turbo says, we have a few snow days already this winter. Oh, right. Is that chocolate brown? Yes, I can't eat it, unfortunately, but it is chocolate brown. It is very lovely. It will look good against the winter mud. What? I will blend in. Sean's Garden says, no wonder there are no sheep in the field since he started wearing jumpers. Well, I'm trying. I don't know whether this is Mary, is this 100% wool? It does feel like wool. I believe wool is very expensive, which is odd, isn't it? Because we keep hearing stories of fleeces, farmers, sheep farmers, having to burn fleeces or dump them. So I don't understand why British wool should be that expensive. And the lovely Julia there says she does love those jumpers. Josh Hastings there says, hello, nice jersey, nice colour too. No more comments, as we'll be listening while driving. All right, well, good luck with the driving. Good stuff. Great. Anyway, lovely to see you all. We're just getting over to the hour, and I did actually remember to turn the feed on, which is good. Mary says, no, not pure wool. Oh. I want pure wool next time. Pure wool. Very, very dark plum indigo would be lovely too. In fact, Mary sent me to some websites to have a look at for the next batch, if she's still up for doing it, which clearly she is, to have a look at the colour swatch so that one can choose different colours. Nice dark plum indigo would be lovely too. I've got a sort of burgundy. Is it different to burgundy? You know the burgundy one that I wear. Anyway, enough about jumpers. Whatever it is, I mean, even if it's not 100% wool, I can tell you what, it is warm. These jumpers are warm, and they do the job very well. So I'm absolutely thrilled. So, yeah, right. We have gone to whatever chapter it is. This is our part 5, chapter 10, part 3, I think, in the book, if you're following at home. And this is, if you remember, the little boy, Ginger, and his mate, Spud. Mary says pure wool would cost a lot more. It would be interesting to see what the difference is, though, wouldn't it? I wonder, you'd have to 100% lovely, that's for sure, says the lovely Julia. I'd be interested to see how much more it would be and what the difference is with 100% pure wool. Just out of curiosity, really. Is there any difference in terms of the warmth, the length, not the length of the jumper, but the length you can keep it, and all of that? What factors there are to sum up? Neon, oh thanks, would be good for these dark winter walks. No, definitely not neon. So Ginger and Spud were firing a makeshift arrow, if you remember last time. And unfortunately, I think Ginger lost the arrow over the wall in the girls' half of the school, of the hospital, of the. It calls it a hospital, but I suppose really it's an orphanage, isn't it? 100% handmade, absolutely 100% handmade. I mean, I'm not knocking any of these. That's why I keep ordering them. They're just so gorgeous jumpers. Mary has an amazing skill, amazing talent for making them, and I'm very, very pleased to be wearing them, and they look magnificent. Do you feel like jumping when you're wearing it? I do, actually. I do jump about. I jumped with joy when the parcel arrived this morning. Talking of parcels, actually, somebody very kindly has sent me a phone. A mobile phone. This isn't it. That's my mobile phone. But somebody got in touch with me and said, I've seen the phone that you use in the Vogue show, which is a sellotaped old knackered thing, which is true. And they said, I've got a phone, I'm getting rid of it. Would you like it? And I said, oh, that'd be very generous. That's very kind of you. For the show. And they said, well, we sent it in the post. It'll arrive between 11 and 4 today. But it hasn't arrived. So any minute I'm expecting a knock at the door. Thanks. I'm expecting a knock at the door and somebody, they're a little bit late and going, here's your parcel. But they haven't arrived yet, so we should be safe. Right, how are we doing? Justine Jones. Oh, Audrey says, I hope it didn't get the girl in the eye. Well, we're going to find out. Joseph has been incredibly lucky receiving jumpers from Mary too. Yes, he's been very lucky, actually. And he looks so smart in them. That's what I like. Ben says, oh, the girl's side of the hospital. I thought it was meant in the poor girl's rib cage. And Sean says, that little lamb, Mary, has been feeling the cold this winter. Yes, well, that poor little lamb has no more wool left. Right, let's carry on. And it starts like this. I lost me arrow. I shan't never get another arrow as straight as that one. It was the best arrow in the world. My bow isn't any good now. Not without my arrow, it isn't. It ain't half as lovely as that arrow. I bet it's sticking into something. But I bet I could find it if I could get over. Bet I could climb that wall. It was the voice of Mr. Dawlish that interrupted him. From the far end of the dormitory it came, tired and drooping, drifting like a pall of smoke across the pattern of Ginger's thoughts. Good night, boys. Go to sleep. No talking. There came the sound of Mr. Dawlish's footsteps, slouch, 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 as he shuffled off down the worn oilcloth of the corridor. Ginger listened carefully. The slouches grew fainter. Mr. Dawlish must be very nearly have reached the stairs by now. The third step was faulty. It had a squeak in it, as though there was a mouse trapped underneath the board. And as Ginger listened, he heard it. Plump, plump, eek, it came. That meant Mr. Dawlish was practically down on the lower landing. The inmates of Collet Dormitory were now left on their honour for the night. This suited Ginger perfectly. Rapidly, but still cautiously, stealthily, he rushed 1 foot out of the bedclothes. The sock was already on it. Then the other foot followed, similarly socked. It was Ginger's private good fortune that he possessed this extra pair of socks that neither Mr. Gurnett nor Mr. Dawlish knew anything about, and in their way they were a very special pair of socks. They had once belonged to a little boy who had died, but he needed more than socks for his purpose, and everything else had to be removed from the locker. He had managed to open the locker cupboard and was drawing on the blue jersey when Spud's head came up from the pillow of the next bed. "You going like you said?" he asked. "Shut up," Ginger answered. "You'll get copped," Spud warned him. "If you don't shut up, I'll bash you," Ginger replied. Satisfied that he had silenced Spud, Ginger went back on all fours and proceeded to crawl under Spud's bed. Spud was all right, really. It was simply that he talked too much. Ginger hadn't any quarrel with him, at least not now that Spud had promised to lend him his gym shoes, he hadn't. And Spud's gym shoes were important. They were a brown pair, whereas Ginger's were white, and white was altogether too conspicuous a colour for where Ginger was going. Now that the moment had come, Ginger did not want any longer... Now that the moment had come, Ginger did not any longer feel himself quite the breed of hero who had planned the expedition. He went over to the window and looked out. The night was black and impenetrable. A kind of chill unfriendliness hung over everything. And there was a wind blowing too, with just enough rain in it to make the slates wet and slippery. But he had boasted too much to Spud about what he was going to do for there to be any turning back now. His whole reputation depended on going through with the plan. "So long, Spud," he said, in as casual-sounding kind of whisper that he could manage. "When I get back, I'll tap 3 times on the window." Spud sat up on one elbow and looked admiringly at Ginger. "Good luck," he said. Ginger was enjoying this moment and wanted to taste the full glory of it. "And better be quick about opening the window," he said. "I'll be in a hurry. Don't you go to sleep now while I'm gone." The first part of the journey was the easiest. It lay along a 4-inch catwalk with the steep roof of the wash-house rising up on the far side. There was nothing to worry about here, except Mr. Dawlish. His room looked straight out onto the catwalk, and Ginger could tell from the slanting square of light on the wet roof that he hadn't got his curtains drawn. If he should happen to be looking out now, the whole game would be up before it had even started. That was why Ginger had to go down on all fours and crawl. Then even the top of his back wouldn't be showing. From the far end of the wash-house roof there was a 10-foot drop. That was easy because there was a drain pipe running down the angle of the wall. Ginger had climbed that drain pipe before. He knew exactly where the footholes were. Less than a minute after he'd passed Mr. Dawlish's room, he was standing upright on the ground with the blank wall of the wash-house sheltering him. This, however, was when he had to be careful. The windows of the Kramer block looked straight out onto the playground, and there were lights in 3 of them. broad, shining trackways like flat searchlights stretched out across the wet asphalt of the playground. Because of them, Ginger had to keep up close to the wall, fairly sliding along beside the brickwork. And to get where he was going, he had to pass right along Mr. Rushgrove's room. That wasn't so good because Mr. Rushgrove wasn't a bit like Mr. Dawlish. He hadn't got spots on his waistcoat and a wet dribbly place on his chin, even when his pipe wasn't in his mouth. Mr. Rushgrove didn't smoke at all, in fact. He looked after the games, and he went 3 times round the playground in running shorts every morning before breakfast. In fact, Mr. Rushgrove was the sort of person that Ginger most wanted to avoid. It would be like having a mastiff on his heels. And there would be one nasty moment, a thorough nasty moment, a moment when Ginger really thought that he had been copped. He had left the Cranmer block safely behind him and was about to slip along the narrow alley between the Ridley block and the end of the juniors' lavatory when he heard Mr. Rushgrove's door opening. And at that same moment he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. This was the worst possible place for such a thing to happen. It was nothing less than a trap, this alleyway. The nearest thing to a hiding place was a wooden box about 3 feet high that projected some 9 inches from the wall. It was where the stopcock of the lavatories were housed, and behind the box Ginger crouched. He gathered his legs up behind him like a cat and turned his head to the wall so that his face shouldn't show up in the white darkness. Then he waited. The footsteps came nearer, and the voice. But it was only one voice, the voice of Mr. Pervarious talking to himself. "Shouldn't be long now," he was saying. "Not so long as it has been, not by a long chalk. Then, to hell with Dr. Trump and the whole bloody lot of them. To red hot... ... Unless Ginger got away now that the alley was clear, he might just as well have stayed in bed. He was in 30 feet of the girls' wall by now. It was the sort of wall that would make a cat think twice before attempting it. But there was one place Ginger knew about where a plane tree grew close up alongside the wall. It was a shabby, elderly specimen of a plane tree, with its skin coming off in slabs and patches, London plane, and its lower boughs lopped back unmercifully, and there was a piece of rope hanging down from the stump of one of the lower limbs. The boys used it for swinging, and Ginger knew that if he swung himself hard enough, he could get himself right up into the tree. Then the rest was plain climbing. At the 3rd attempt, he was successful. He got one leg firmly over a branch and then moved up the tree like a raccoon. The wall seemed higher than he remembered it. He had to go on scrabbling upwards before he could see over the top. And even then, there was an unpleasant black-looking gap between the farthest branch and the brickwork. It was about 4 feet of nothingness that Ginger had to get over somehow. Just slippery, peeling bark on the one side and broken bottle tops on the other. "Cool lummy," Ginger said to himself as he surveyed it. But there was nothing else for it. He went on, wriggling himself cautiously. He went on wriggling himself cautiously along the branch from notch to notch. Then Ginger jumped. He landed square on the broken glass, and, relieved of his weight, the branch sprang in the darkness. "Ah, got there," said Ginger. Then he broke off suddenly. He had just put his hand down to his leg and found that it was wet. The serrated edge of a bottle had slit him right along the calf, and the blood was running down onto Spud's gym shoes. Ginger could feel it like a warm, crawling caterpillar. "I wish I'd bought a bit of rag," Ginger began thinking. Wish I'd thought of it. So far as he could make out, the girls' playground was simply bare asphalt like the boys'. This surprised him because for some reason or other he'd always imagined that on the girls' side of the wall it would be grass, smooth, mown grass. But he was wrong. There was nothing soft to land on anywhere, and it was out of the question trying to wiggle along the wall. The point of the glass dug and jabbed at him every time he moved. So, because he had no intention of being sawn to pieces, he decided to jump. Jump, that is, straight down into the darkness. To cut down the height of the drop, he worked over to the edge and took a grip on one bottle stump more firmly embedded in than the rest. Then, twisting himself round, he dangled there for a moment and let go. Now I've really done it, the thought came back to him as he was falling. Now I'm for it, if I can't get back. Then the hard playground rushed up to meet him, and he landed. It's all very exciting, isn't it? Sneaking about into the girls' side. How are we doing out there? That little Mary. Oh, yes, so everybody's still... ... says Nigel Sedley. Yes, there you go. It was then that the trouble started, and it was the moon that set things off. Up to this moment, unseen and skulking, the moon suddenly appeared brightly shining in a ragged window of cloud high up in the heavens over Hammersmith. The whole playground was lit up as though gas lamps had been turned on. The outline of the Nightingale block and the Victoria wing appeared from nowhere, erected magically out of cardboard. Ginger could see every detail, even the toy fire escape that zigzagged downwards from the junior girls to the entrance of the infants' recreation room. But what was more important was that anyone looking into the playground could see Ginger. And at that moment, Nurse Stedge was standing at her window, her long giraffe neck craning out. She had said her prayers and was twisting up her thin tail of grey hair in readiness to pop a hairnet over it when she thought she had observed a movement. Something black among the shadows. A man! All her life she'd been dreading this. In a flash she saw herself gagged and bound with the nightdress torn and dishevelled while an armed thug casually rifled everything that she possessed. Her handbag, her corals, her snapshot album, her writing case. And how could she be sure that fettered and defenceless as she was, the brute would stop short at material treasure? To preserve her honour, more before consciousness ebbed away, she snatched up the camel-hair dressing-gown and rushed along to Mr. Gurnet. To Mrs. Gurnet. Mrs. Gurnet was already asleep, lying flat on her back with her hands folded like a crusader's upon the prominent projection of her bosom. She was dreaming about Ramsgate. But at the piercing words of "Matron! There's a man in the grounds!" The pier, the kiosks, the pavilion, and the little cafes in Ramsgate all vanished, and Mrs. Gurnet was out of her bed in a bound. Alongside Mrs. Gurnet's stockingness, Nurse Stedge felt safer, but only for a moment, for Mrs. Gurnet's orders were callous and terrible. Go and tell Sergeant Chiswick," was all she said. "Go?" Nurse Stedge faltered. "Across the playground with him there?" "Then go round the back way," Mrs. Gurnet replied tersely. "And if you see anything, scream. I'll be here." "Yes, matron," Nurse Stedge replied meekly. As soon as Nurse Stedge was gone, Mrs. Gurnet went back over to the window to keep watch. The moon, meanwhile, had gone in again. Behind her, Mrs. Gurnet could see nothing. but inky blackness, in which a whole regiment of men could have lurked without being detected. Then, out of the darkness, came a scream. Nurse Stedge's scream. It rose, shrill and cutting like a bandsaw out of the still night air, and Mrs. Gurnet's heart gave a sudden bump as she realised that she had sent this faithful, frightened woman to her death. Heaving the big sash window in front of her, she had four arms like a lumberjack's. She yelled, "Murder!" Ginger had heard both the scream and Mrs. Gurnet's agonising cry, and he was frightened. Really frightened this time. "I'm going back," he said. "I want to be in bed. I want to be next to Spud." But the scream... What was it that had... Sorry. But the scream... What... Stop it. That's my phone pinging away there. What was it that had so alarmed Nurse Stedge? As it happened, it was Mr. Pavarius. His evening stroll over, he was on his way back to his room when he saw Nurse Stedge coming towards him, one hand outstretched for protection against unseen assailants, and the other tightly gripping the neck-band of her dressing-room. Admittedly, in the darkness, Mr. Pavarius could not tell it was Nurse Stedge. He couldn't even see that it was a lady, in fact. But he should have been more careful, more considerate of other people's nighttime jumpiness. He should definitely not have stepped out suddenly from a doorway and said, "Boo!" In the result, he had a fainting woman on his hands. And it was not only Mrs. Gurnet who had heard the scream, Mr. Rushgrove had heard it. He was just finishing his trunk-bending exercises at the time, and grabbing hold of a rounder's bat, he tore off just as he was in his vest and singlet, ready to beat up all comers. Nor was Mr. Rushgrove alone in his intervention. Dr. Trump himself had been roused. He was not in bed. He was still finishing a sermon. He had just started the last page and had taken his shoe off to scratch his foot when he thought he heard a scream. Then, just because Mr. Gurnet's window was just opposite his own, he was nearly knocked out of his chair by the cry of "Murder!" Scuffling his shoe on again and pressing his glasses more firmly into a place, he set off down the stairs, armed except for a police whistle. This was no time for him to think about weapons. By now, Nurse Stedge had recovered sufficiently to be able to speak, but only to Mr. Rushgrove. It was significant that she could still not bring herself to utter a word to Mr. Pavarius, but encouraged by the sight of the rounder's bat and Mr. Rushgrove's huge biceps, she told everything. Above all, she urged him to hurry. She was terrified lest the intruder, the burglar, the sex maniac, should already be loose among the innocents, pilfering, slaughtering, slashing to the right and left among the cradles. And by now it was a powerful enough sort of posse that had assembled. Mr. Rushgrove led, only because no one else could keep up with him. Then came Dr. Trump, his bare fists clenched in readiness, and his police whistle firmly clenched between his teeth. Next, Sergeant Chiswick, swinging a truncheon, and finally Mr. Pavarius, sauntering nonchalantly, incredulous. Nurse Stedge, dismayed by the thought of her negligee before so many men, had returned to her bedroom to dress properly in readiness for the kill. She was not a sadistic woman, but even so, she gave a little shudder of joyous anticipation as she heard the key inserted into a padlock of the green-spiked gate that led into the girls' playground. Ginger heard it too. As it happened, he was only just on the other side of the gate at the time, and at that moment the moon again disentangled herself from the skin of a cloud. Mr. Rushgrove saw Ginger as soon as he entered, and Ginger saw Mr. Rushgrove. Then the moon began playing tricks on them, blazing forth at one moment like a beacon, and she hid herself coyly at the next. It was like hunting by flashlights. No sooner was Mr. Rushgrove hotly on the trail than he lost it again. But the shouts from Dr. Trump and the pounding feet of Sergeant Chiswick were enough to warn Ginger that they were closing in on him. He was flat against the junior girls' block by now, alongside the infants' recreation room, and the darkness in front of him was full of charging figures. This was the end. There was no escaping this time. They'd get him in a moment. Then he saw the zigzag fire escape. He didn't know where it led to, didn't know whether there would be an outlet that way. It was simply with that instinct of any haunted, anxious animal that he began climbing, intended to go on climbing, in fact, until he could climb no farther. The steps were of iron lattice. He mounted 2 at a time. The night was now blacker and sticklier than ever. He could see nothing, but he could feel. And by the time he reached the 6th landing, the ladder gave up the shudder. No, it didn't. It gave a shudder. That meant Mr. Rushgrove was bounding up after him. Until that moment, Ginger had tended to go right on up to the roof, if he could get there. But as he was rounding the next bend, he saw an open window a couple of feet above him, and he jumped for it. Because he was desperate, his fingers were firm, like hooks. They grabbed onto the wet woodwork, and with a heave he drew himself up and got one leg over the sill, and just got the other leg over and was lowering himself onto the floor inside when he heard Mr. Rushgrove, breathing deeply, go thumping past him in the darkness. "Caw," said Ginger devoutly. But he could hardly stay where he was. It was the girls' dormitory. If they found him there, they would probably send him to prison or something. And already the disturbance had roused the whole block. As he crouched there, he saw the glass panel in the door suddenly spring into brightness, and knew that the corridor light had been put on. Then, in that dim dormitory, with the long line of beds, all exactly like the one he'd left on the other side of the hospital, he felt a hand come out of nowhere and touch him. He was so frightened that he was nearly sick. But when he turned, he saw that it was nothing to be afraid of, really. The hand belonged to the little girl in the bed beside him, and as he looked, she removed her hand and put her finger up against her lips, warningly. Then, as he looked closely, he saw a fringe of dark hair across her forehead and a pair of eyes that looked enormous over the edge of the bed. "Are they after you?" she said in a low whisper. "Better get in by me. Then you can hide." And as she said it, she lifted up the corner of the bedclothes in readiness. This was Ginger's first meeting with Sweetie. Ooh. Blimey, that was a bit of tense, wasn't it? Dudley Sawyer's just arrived, had to wind up the Wi-Fi. Oh, it's so terrible when you've got to wind up the Wi-Fi. All A-OK, he says. All jolly good. Lee Lawson says, we were expecting an electrician to call in a minute. Our kitchen light isn't working. I've packed up the March lockdown too, so might get called away. Oh, well, I'm waiting for a delivery and it's not yet arrived. How frustrating. Whew. Well, we're nearly at the end of this chapter, so let's just get there and see how we're doing. The whole incident remained unexplained and inexplicable. By the time the police arrived, Ginger had quit Sweetie's bed, had gone back down the fire escape. Because he was a bit rushed, there was no time to say goodbye properly, and in the circumstances, Sweetie did not attempt to detain him. "I'm going," Ginger suddenly announced, and all that Sweetie replied was, "I won't tell." That was the whole of the leave-taking. It was simple, brief, but sufficient. And in comparison with the outward journey, the way back was absurdly easy. When Sergeant Chiswick had unpadlocked the spike gate marked Girls Private, he had left it open after the posse had passed. Ginger had slipped through as quietly as an errand boy, Less than 5 minutes after leaving Sweetie's bed, Ginger was back in his own bed and Spud's gym shoes were in the locker where they belonged. It was only Spud himself who was in trouble. Oh, sorry, it was only Spud himself who was the trouble. "Did you get it?" he hoarsed loudly. But this time Ginger's reply was so astonishing that Spud did not ask any further questions. "Shut up," Ginger answered. "There's been a murder." It's exciting, isn't it? Very exciting. Any more of that coffee? The coffee is stone cold. Right. I was just thinking that, and it's all because the lady loves milk tray. Absolutely. Shame we forgot to bring Sweetie our box. Oh yes, there we go. Dum da dum dum dum. Chapter 11. It is always strange in the infirmary, not just shadowy, mysterious, interesting, full of puzzles. It's another world. Different faces, different uniforms. Everyone in the infirmary wore white and looked like seagulls with big stiff butterflies resting on top of them. Different sounds. The beds in the infirmary were mounted on rubber wheels and squeaked when anybody moved in them. A different smell, particularly a different smell, a smell like petrol, only it wasn't petrol. Petrol with soap and carbolic mixed up with it. It was the cleanest smell that Sweetie had ever known, as though the air itself had been sponged down and rinsed through with the stuff. Also, it was horrid. Sweetie wasn't very ill, just a temperature that kept running up and down and a bit of a sore throat, but Mrs. Gurnett had decided that she would be better in the infirmary. Then they could tell if it was going to be anything. But tonight something important was going on, so important that Sweetie felt out of it. There were 6 other children in the ward, and one of them, quite a small girl, was very ill too. Sweetie could hear her scratching and scratching all night long. That wasn't the one, however, that they were worrying about. It was a big girl, a girl of 9 or 10, with thick red hair, who was the centre of everything. She had been in the next bed to hers when Sweetie had first been brought in, but they had moved her out now, right up to the end of the ward, away from everyone. Then, as though that weren't bad enough, they put a screen around her. That was cruel, Sweetie thought, and it made her angry, and Sweetie could tell that the red-haired girl minded. She could tell from the sound of that her breathing made. It was very noisy breathing, as though she'd been crying and had got herself all stopped up inside. The breathing was the loudest sound in the infirmary, except for the scratch, scratch, scratch 2 beds away, and it seemed still louder because everything else was so quiet. It was night outside. Everyone else in London was asleep. Didn't have blimmin' sirens going all night long back in 1950s, I suppose. The night nurse had shifted the screen a little, and Sweetie could see through the gap where the hinge was fixed. There was a light on the other side, and she could see the big girl's red hair quite plainly, and her face. But something had happened to her face. It was red too, like her hair, and one of the nurses kept sponging her forehead. When Sweetie watched, she saw the nurse pour something into the girl's mouth, straight from the teapot. I suppose they're sorry now that they were being so nasty to her, Sweetie thought. They're now trying to make up for it. Then the doctor came. This was very interesting, because she'd never seen the doctor come at night time before. He was dressed in his ordinary clothes, dark, thick sort of clothes, and he carried his bag, the one that he always took whenever he came. She couldn't see what the doctor was doing, and that was because his back was in the way. If he'd been over the other side, she would have seen perfectly, but he was there for a long time, and she thought, though she couldn't be sure, that he was sticking something into her. But something else was going on. The doctor came into sight again from the screen and walked back down the wards towards Sweetie. He looked across. He looked cross, Sweetie thought, or worried, or else he'd lost something. It's difficult to tell what grown-ups are thinking when they're frowning, and she didn't want to look too closely because she was supposed to be asleep. She very nearly was asleep when the doctor came back, but this time it was more interesting than ever because the doctor got Sergeant Chiswick with him, and Sergeant Chiswick was carrying something that she'd never seen before. It was round and long and heavy, and it was metal. Then she recognised it. There was one of them in the room where the dentist came to see if your teeth were all right, and it was something to do with having a tooth out that it didn't... it was something to do with having a tooth out so that it didn't hurt. So that explained everything. The red girl had got toothache, and the doctor had borrowed something so that he could pull it out. Perhaps Sergeant Chiswick was going to help. Perhaps he always helped because he was so strong from carrying buckets and things. There was now a new sound in the infirmary, a faint, high hissing sound like a faraway kettle boiling, and the new smell, another petrol-y kind of smell, only sharper, and the shadow on the wall was fixing something over the little girl's nose. It was a box with a tube to it, which was rather thoughtless really, because if he held it there much longer, the girl wouldn't be able to breathe. Then, interesting though it was, Sweetie dozed off because she was so sleepy. And when she woke up again, everything was different. At the end of the bed, Dr. Trump was down on his knees in that long dressing gown of his, as though he were praying. The doctor was putting the things away in his bag. But what the night nurse was doing was the strangest that Sweetie had ever seen. She had got hold of the sheet and was lifting it up over the little girl, the red-haired girl's face, right up so that her face was completely covered. She'll smother her. If they leave it there, Sweetie thought, she won't be able to breathe. Sweetie never knew whether she had really seen them carry the red-haired girl, still with her face covered up, out of the ward and away to some other part of the hospital. Either she had seen it or dreamt it probably because she was now very sleepy. But a little later on she certainly asked for a drink of water, and the night nurse seemed surprised to find that she was still awake. "Have you been awake long?" she asked suspiciously. And because she sounded so suspicious, Sweetie lied to her. I just woke up. I was thirsty." That seemed to satisfy the night nurse. She went away again, and Sweetie lay there thinking. It had been a long drink of water that she had taken, and she felt thoroughly wide awake again. It was while she was awake she heard the night nurse say something to Mrs. Gurnett. She didn't hear all of it, but she heard enough. "Not that they ever notice anything," was what she said. "Half the ward could die and the other half wouldn't know anything about it." Then Sweetie knew what had happened. And with the knowledge, she didn't even attempt to go to sleep again. She was too excited. She knew about dying, and she understood it. So that was the way it happened. And because that was the way, she was careful to push the bedclothes down, right down, so that they couldn't possibly ride up over her face if she didn't go to sleep. So, what do you make of that then, ladies and gentlemen? She's obviously witnessed this poor girl who died and thought that by shoving a sheet over her head, it's killed her off. Whew. Anyway, that was That was chapter, whatever the chapter that was. We're on chapter 12. How are we doing time-wise? Oh, we've got a bit of time. Still enjoying it? Still understand what's going on? Ed Loud says, I quite like the smell of petrol and carbolic soap, but not for everyone, surely. Absolutely. Eau de Carbolic by Dior, says Dudley. Yeah. Chapter 12, Part 1. Ever since that Sunday afternoon at Dame Eleanor's, when he had first met his bishop on equal social terms, Dr. Trump had been a regular visitor to the Warples. He was also welcome. That he was welcome was obvious, but also was practically everybody else. On Wednesday, particularly on what the bishop always referred to his midweek, the salon was always packed solid like a waiting room. Young adolescent-looking curates, battered, despondent ministers from the East End parishes, swarthy missionaries home on furlough. Furlough. Look at that. Furlough is mentioned in this book from 1950s, and I thought that was a 2020 word. Young adolescent-looking curates, battered, despondent ministers from the East End parishes, swarthy missionaries home on furlough, lay deaconesses, church helpers, the whole miscellaneous company of ecclesiastical well-wishers were there. More than once, in fact, Dr. Trump had wondered whether he was possibly cheapening himself a little by going among them so indiscriminately. There was one reason, however, why Dr. Trump continued his visits, and that was because after the cocoa tray and the cake tiers had been cleared away, the bishop always asked him to stay behind for a cosy, informal chat. Then everything was changed. It all became quite delightful. There were usually three of them, the bishop, himself, Dr. Trump, and Miss Warple, at once girlish and bird-like, perched on a fancy beadwork poof. No, Mrs. Warple, no. Somebody's just come in. I bet that's Sharifa. Sneaking up the stairs. She's in. No Miss Warple. No Mrs. Warple. That was significant. But Mother was an invalid. This much had been conveyed to Dr. Trump at an earlier meeting. Mrs. Warple lived mysteriously in the perpetual purdah of her bedroom, and the soirees, the conversations, the little informal get-togethers had to jog along without her. Tonight had promised to be such an evening. Dr. Trump had been looking forward to it all week, fairly licking his lips for more revelations of episcopal intrigue at Lambeth, more disclosures of archdeaconal plot and counterplot. It was obvious to Dr. Trump as soon as he arrived that the bishop was far from being at his best. Earlier in the week, Bishop Warple had caught a chill at an unveiling ceremony, and he had now withdrawn almost entirely from the world, enclosing himself in a thick, impenetrable cocoon of peppermint and eucalyptus. Shortly after 10 o'clock, therefore, as soon as the last of the casuals, a saturnine, Dracula-like prison chaplain from Brixton had moved moodily off into the darkness, Bishop Warple announced loudly and abruptly that he was going to bed. Dr. Trump rose obediently, but Miss Warple intervened. "Go on telling me about your house captain plan," she pleaded. "You know we were interrupted." And so after the bishop had left them carrying with him his inhaler, his screwed-up handkerchief, and his tin of lozenges, Dr. Trump found himself sitting there alone with Felicity Warple. Because Miss Warple was so keenly, extraordinarily interested in school discipline... Will you stop making that stupid noise? Because Miss Walpole was so keenly, extraordinarily interested in school discipline, she instinctively moved over onto the couch beside him. It was a long, unyielding sort of couch, and there was a good 18 inches or more separating them. To Mr. Trump's relief, Miss Walpole made no attempt to close the gap. On the contrary, she sat round sideways so that she could see him while he was talking. But in a way this was worse, for she had such a strangely penetrating look in her eye, an intense gimlet stare, that it was like sharing a settee with a basilisk, whatever a basilisk is, and Dr. Trump found himself faltering beneath it. He grew nervous. He changed the subject first to sacred music, and then to infant diet, and then to girls' sports. But it made no difference. Miss Walpole was equally interested in all of them. And then, to his astonishment, he discovered that she had not been listening at all. With those hard avian eyes focused somewhere right inside his skull, she suddenly addressed him. "Dr. Trump," she said trilly, "you'll have to go." This remark was so unexpected, so uncalled for, that Dr. Trump drew back as though he'd been stung. Then he took a firm hold of himself. "Well, I was actually on the point of departure," he said coldly. "In fact, I was already going. Good evening." But it was evident that more than an overstayed welcome lay behind it all, for Miss Walpole continued as shrilly as ever. "And you mustn't come here any more, ever." Her voice rose to a high, flute-like scream as she pronounced the last word, and Dr. Trump felt a wave of icy coldness pass across his stomach. This was no ordinary behaviour. It was hysteria, even madness, possibly. Terrible thoughts began to race through his brain. Perhaps if it were madness, it was inherited. Perhaps at this moment, in the barred room upstairs, Mrs. Walpole... Dr. Trump realised now that at all costs he must remain calm. If he were to lose control of himself, even for a moment, they would both be gibbering and grimacing at each other. Before he parried. "Just as you say," he said, "just as you say." "Then you admit it?" she demanded. Admit what?" he said, trying to edge inconspicuously in the direction of the door handle. "That they're talking about us," she replied. "Everyone's talking. You know they are." The answer was snapped back at him so viciously that he instinctively stepped back again. So it was madness, complete and fully developed. It was voices in the poor girl's head that she thought she was hearing. Now, more than ever, it was necessary to humour her. Yes, quite so," he answered, "quite so." "Then I'm going to put an end to it if you won't," she said. She sank back onto the couch as she was speaking and began crying. The thin features were puckered up and drawn, and the tears ran down in twin rivulets on either side of the sharp nose. Dr. Trump glanced from Miss Walpole to the door and back to Miss Walpole and finally to the door again, and it was here that he made his first mistake. For instead of making a dash for it, he moved slowly and with dignity, talking as he went. "I entirely fail to comprehend your meaning," he said, with gravity. I cannot conceive why our names should have been coupled." A fresh sob rose from the couch. "Then they're wrong," Miss Walpole moaned. You don't like me." "Oh, but I do, I assure you," Dr. Trump replied, still backing. "I value our friendship most highly." And it was here that Dr. Trump made his second mistake. "Hadn't we better shake hands and be friends?" he asked, suavely. Miss Walpole struggled to her feet. Now that she was standing up, she looked terrible, as though she'd been crying for months on end. Her eyes were pink-rimmed and sunken, and her mouth quivered. "Leave me alone," was all she asked. "Can't you just leave me alone now it's all over?" "But don't you want to be Don't you want me to be your friend?" "And is that all you want it to be?" "Isn't it sufficient?" Miss Worple didn't reply. Instead, the tears welled up again, and the moan restarted. Dr. Trump had never been in such close, such intimate contact with a young woman in tears, and he was astonished to find that he was suddenly consumed by a great and overwhelming pity. The wild words that she had spoken had gone sailing past him like the wind. After all, he was older than she was, and a man. He could afford to be magnanimous. "Felicity," he said at last, speaking like an elder brother. "Samuel?" Miss Worple replied, not in the least like a younger sister. I don't like to see you crying," he told her gently. And this is here, and it was here, that Dr. Trump made his third and consummate mistake. For while he was speaking, he opened his arms appealingly, as one might, to soothe a child. And as he did so, Miss Worple sprang into them. You could see that she was that they, the Worples, Bishop Worple and Dame Eleanor, had set a trap so that Dr. Trump would marry this girl they want him to marry, this no good daughter of the bishop. I'm presumingly is what's going on there. The door creaked. A mystery caller backed down the hallway. "Your phone is probably trying to tell you why the package is late." "Oh, yes. A basilisk is a lizard." "Oh, thank you very much for that." Blast blurred the crusty rolls. The suspense of the reading had me distracted. It's a huge compliment to Richard's reading today. Oh, thank you very much, although I was sort of cocking up a little bit. I don't know where this... Yes, ping, ping, ping. I think it's the Facebook app. He's pinging at me. It doesn't normally ping like that, but it's been pinging today. Cliffhanger. A cliffhanger. Yes, well, we're at the time, aren't we? And we will continue with that tomorrow. Ding. There it goes again. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been absolutely interesting and fun and thrilling, and we've had Ginger sneaking in and meeting Sweetie. I know that that's a significant thing. And Dr. Trump, who, starts off as this sort of nasally nasty, who's now in this tight... It'd be interesting to try and cast this, would it not, from the 1950s film stars, British film stars. Who would you put in as Dr. Trump? And who would you put as Mr. Dawlish? So Mr. What's his name? I can't even think of his name now. Without seeing it written down. Pervarious, Dr. Pervarious, Mr. Pervarious. Who would you have down there? Mr. Pervarious is a bit like John Le Mesurier, isn't he? It's a sort of very vague sort of character, aimlessly wandering around. So it'd be interesting. We'll have to think about that. We'll have to think about casting the characters. Anyway, Dr. Trump character will be the president in a few decades, says Sean. Thanks again. Great stuff. Don't forget the box of milk tray tomorrow. Pervarious, thank you very much. Good stuff. Charles Hawtrey. Oh, yes. Yes, that's a good one. Charles Hawtrey. Yes, it's sort of almost an Alistair. Dr. Trump is almost an Alistair Sim character in a way. You could see Alistair Sim playing him, this sort of desperately trying to impress everybody but failing miserably. Shan't sleep tonight. Great reading, says Dudley. Thank you very much. I hope you do. Anyway, take care. Meanwhile, we go on. I'm just going to stick a log on the Essie. There's a video ready for you tomorrow, and we will do some more reading tomorrow. No Vogue show or anything tonight. So thank you for watching. Take care. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.